The morning sun had barely risen over the tall buildings of downtown Manhattan when Marcus Bennett stepped out of his black Tesla Model S. Like every other weekday morning, the 35-year-old investment banker was heading to his favorite coffee shop, the Daily Grind, to get his usual double-shot espresso before work. Marcus looked exactly like what people expected a successful Wall Street executive to look like. Perfectly trimmed brown hair, expensive gray suit, and a gold Rolex watch that cost more than most people's monthly salary. But there was something different about him that his wealthy colleagues didn't understand. He always noticed the homeless woman who sat outside the coffee shop. Her name was Eleanor Washington, and she had been there every day for the past 8 months. Unlike other homeless people who asked for money, Eleanor spent her days creating beautiful hand-drawn cards and trying to sell them for a few dollars each. She kept herself clean despite her circumstances, wearing neat but worn-out clothes and always maintaining a dignity that caught Marcus's attention. "Good morning, Eleanor," Marcus said, stopping in front of her small display of cards. Today was colder than usual, and he noticed her hands shaking slightly as she worked on a new drawing. "Morning, Mr. Bennett," Eleanor replied with a gentle smile. She was in her early 40s, with dark skin marked by years of life's challenges, but her eyes still sparkled with intelligence and warmth. "Would you like to see my new designs?" Marcus checked his expensive watch. He was early for his first meeting, so he decided to stay for a few minutes. "Sure, why not?" He crouched down to look at her artwork, careful not to get his $3,000 suit dirty. Eleanor's hands carefully picked up a few cards. Each one showed detailed drawings of New York City scenes: a mother and child in Central Park, an old couple feeding pigeons, teenagers playing basketball in a neighborhood court. The artwork was surprisingly professional. "These are really good," Marcus said, genuinely impressed. "Did you study art?" Eleanor's eyes clouded over for a moment before she answered. "I was an art teacher for 15 years at Lincoln High School in Brooklyn." She paused, adjusting her worn wool scarf. "Life can change quickly, Mr. Bennett." Marcus felt something shift inside him. He had passed by Eleanor hundreds of times, exchanged polite greetings, bought her cards, but he had never really known her story. "What happened?" he asked softly. Eleanor looked up at the tall buildings around them, as if seeing her past reflected in their windows. "Sometimes life gives you choices that aren't really choices at all," she said. "My mother got sick, cancer. I had to choose between paying for her treatment and keeping my apartment. Then the school had budget cuts, and my position was eliminated." A businessman walked past them, deliberately looking away from Eleanor while clutching his briefcase tighter. Marcus noticed her slight flinch at this familiar reaction. "But you still make art," Marcus observed, pointing to her cards. "Art is who I am, not what I have," Eleanor replied with quiet pride. "I may have lost my home, but I didn't lose myself." Marcus felt a strange mix of emotions: respect, sadness, and something else he couldn't quite name. He bought all the cards Eleanor had finished, paying her $50 for each one, even though she tried to protest the generous amount. As he was about to enter the coffee shop, he turned back. "Would you like a coffee, Eleanor? It's pretty cold today." "That would be nice," she said, surprised by the offer. "Just plain black coffee, please. And Mr. Bennett?" she called after him. "Thank you for always seeing me. Most people look right through me as if I'm invisible." Marcus nodded, feeling slightly embarrassed by her gratitude for such a simple act of human decency. Inside the coffee shop, as he waited for their drinks, he watched Eleanor through the window. She was already working on a new card, her artistic focus unbroken by her circumstances. What Marcus didn't know at that moment was that this ordinary morning would lead to an extraordinary chain of events. A simple act of stopping to really listen to Eleanor's story would soon pull both of them into a situation neither could have imagined. And it would all begin with an invitation that was sitting unopened in Marcus's mailbox at home. Later that evening, Marcus sat alone in his luxury apartment on the 45th floor, staring at the cream-colored envelope in his hands. The expensive paper felt heavy, almost as heavy as the feelings it brought up inside him. His housekeeper, Mrs. Rodriguez, had placed it on top of his mail pile, not knowing what emotions it would stir. "Mr. and Mrs. James Cooper request your presence at the marriage of their daughter, Sarah Cooper, to Jonathan Pierce." Marcus read the words again and again, each time feeling like someone was twisting a knife in his chest. Sarah, his ex-fiancée. Jonathan, his former business partner and best friend. The wedding was happening in exactly 1 month. 3 years ago, Marcus had thought he had everything figured out. He and Sarah had been together for 5 years, planning their perfect life. Then one day, he came home early from a business trip to surprise her, only to find her and Jonathan together in their apartment. The memory still made his hands shake. He walked to his floor-to-ceiling windows, looking down at the glittering city below. His reflection stared back at him, successful, wealthy, and completely alone. Why had they even invited him? Was it guilt? Or did they want to show off their happiness? Marcus poured himself a glass of expensive whiskey and sat down on his leather couch. His phone buzzed with a text from his mother. "Did you get Sarah's wedding invitation? You should bring a date, sweetheart. Show them you've moved on." Moved on? Marcus laughed bitterly. Sure, he'd gone on plenty of dates since Sarah. Beautiful women, successful women, women his mother would approve of. But none of them felt real. They all wanted something: his money, his status, his connections. As he took another sip of whiskey, his mind wandered to Eleanor, the homeless woman he'd met that morning. He thought about how genuine she'd seemed, how her eyes held no judgment or greed when she looked at him. Just honest gratitude for being treated like a human being. Then, like a bolt of lightning, an idea struck him. It was crazy. It was inappropriate. It was possibly the worst idea he'd ever had. Or maybe it was brilliant. The next morning, Marcus left his apartment earlier than usual. He stopped at a small bakery and bought 2 fresh croissants and hot coffees before heading to the daily grind. Eleanor was already there, setting up her cards for the day. "Good morning, Eleanor," Marcus said, holding out the coffee and croissant. "I brought breakfast." Eleanor looked surprised but accepted the food gratefully. "Thank you, Mr. Bennett. You're very kind." Marcus sat down on the cold concrete beside her, not caring about his expensive suit anymore. People walking by stared at them, but he ignored their looks. "Eleanor, I have something to ask you. It's unusual." She took a sip of her coffee, watching him curiously. "What is it?" "I got invited to a wedding," Marcus started, then paused. "How do you ask a homeless woman to be your date to your ex-fiancee's wedding?" "It's my ex-fiancee's wedding. She's marrying my former best friend." Eleanor's eyes showed understanding. "That must be painful." "Yes," Marcus admitted. "And I have to go. Family obligations, business connections. You know how it is." He took a deep breath. "Eleanor, would you consider being my date to this wedding?" Eleanor nearly choked on her croissant. "Excuse me?" "I know it sounds crazy," Marcus said quickly, "but you're one of the most genuine people I've met in this city. I'd pay for everything: clothes, hair, makeup, whatever you need. Plus, I'd compensate you generously for your time." Eleanor was quiet for a long moment, studying his face. "Mr. Bennett, are you asking me to help you get revenge on your ex-fiancée?" Marcus opened his mouth to deny it, then closed it again. Was he? Maybe partly, he admitted honestly. But mostly, "I think I'd just like to bring someone real to an event full of fake people." Eleanor looked down at her worn clothes, then back at Marcus. "You do realize what people will think? A rich white man bringing a homeless black woman to a high society wedding?" "I don't care what they think," Marcus said, surprising himself by how much he meant it. Eleanor picked up one of her cards and studied it thoughtfully. Finally, she looked back at Marcus with a slight smile. "When's the wedding?" 3 weeks before the wedding, Marcus's plan to help Eleanor prepare began. He had booked her into a comfortable room at the Marriott Hotel, not too fancy but clean and safe. At first, Eleanor had refused such expensive help, but Marcus insisted it was part of their agreement. After all, she couldn't prepare for a high society wedding while living on the streets. "This is the first time I've slept in a real bed in 8 months," Eleanor said quietly when Marcus came to pick her up for their first day of preparations. She was wearing the same clean but worn clothes, but she had washed her hair in the hotel shower and looked refreshed. Their first stop was a high-end department store. Marcus had arranged for a personal shopper named Lisa to help them. When they walked in, Lisa's smile faltered slightly as she looked at Eleanor, but she quickly covered it up with professional politeness. "We'll need everything," Marcus explained. "Casual clothes, formal wear, and of course, a special dress for the wedding." Eleanor stood uncomfortably as Lisa measured her. "Mr. Bennett, this isn't necessary. Just one dress for the wedding would bay. Please, Marcus cut her off gently. You're doing me a favor. Let me do this properly. For the next 2 hours, Eleanor tried on more clothes than she had owned in the past 5 years. Lisa's initial hesitation disappeared as she noticed Eleanor's natural grace and good taste. Soon, they were actually having fun, with Eleanor showing a knowledge of fashion that surprised both Lisa and Marcus. I used to read fashion magazines in the library, Eleanor explained, smoothing down a navy blue dress that fit her perfectly. Just because you're homeless doesn't mean you stop appreciating beautiful things. After choosing several everyday outfits, they moved on to wedding dresses. Lisa brought out dress after dress, but nothing seemed quite right. Then Eleanor spotted something in the corner of the boutique. Could I try that one? She asked, pointing to a deep burgundy dress with simple, elegant lines. When Eleanor emerged from the dressing room wearing it, both Marcus and Lisa fell silent. The dress seemed made for her, highlighting her dignity and grace rather than trying to transform her into someone else. This is the one, Marcus said softly. Next came shoes, accessories, and a visit to a high-end salon. The stylist, Miguel, listened carefully as Eleanor explained she wanted to look elegant but natural. He worked with her natural hair texture rather than trying to change it, creating a style that made her look like she had stepped off a magazine cover. You have amazing bone structure, Miguel commented as he worked. And such expressive eyes. We just need to enhance what's already there. As Eleanor sat in the salon chair, Marcus noticed her looking at her reflection in the mirror with a mix of emotions. Everything okay? He asked. It's strange, she replied. I still feel like myself, but I forgot this version of me existed. She touched her hair gently. When you're homeless, you become invisible. People look past you. You start to forget that you can be beautiful. Marcus felt a sudden pang of guilt. Was he just using Eleanor for his own revenge? But watching her transformation, he realized something was changing in him too. He was seeing her, really seeing her, as a person with her own story, not just a prop in his plan. Their last stop was a small cafe for lunch. Eleanor was now dressed in one of her new outfits, a simple blue dress with comfortable flats. As they ate, Marcus noticed she had perfect table manners and knew exactly which fork to use. I wasn't always homeless, she said, noticing his observation. I had a life, a career, a home. I went to nice restaurants and fancy parties. She paused, stirring her tea. Life just has a way of taking unexpected turns. As they were finishing lunch, Eleanor pulled out one of her hand-drawn cards from her old bag, the only thing she had kept from her street life. She slid it across the table to Marcus. What's this? He asked, picking it up. It's us, from this morning, she said. Marcus looked at the card. She had captured their reflection in the department store mirror, him in his expensive suit, her in her new dress. But somehow, in her drawing, they looked equal, just two people helping each other find something they had lost. The night before the wedding, Marcus invited Eleanor to dinner in his apartment. He wanted to make sure they had their stories straight for tomorrow's event. Eleanor stood by his floor-to-ceiling windows, looking out at the city lights in her new navy blue dress. She could see the street corner where she used to sit, now so far below. It looks different from up here, she said softly. The whole city does. Marcus was opening a bottle of wine in his modern kitchen. Different how? Down there, you see the city's heart. People rushing, struggling, helping each other sometimes. Up here, it's just pretty lights. Eleanor turned from the window. Like two different worlds. They sat down at Marcus's dining table, where he had ordered food from an expensive Italian restaurant. Eleanor took small, polite bites, but something seemed to be bothering her. What's wrong? Marcus asked, noticing her quietness. Eleanor put down her fork carefully. Mr. Bennett. Please call me Marcus. After all this, I think we're past formalities. Marcus, she started again, I need to tell you something before tomorrow. You should know my whole story. She took a deep breath. I wasn't just an art teacher. I was actually quite successful before. Everything. Marcus leaned forward, interested. He had always sensed there was more to her story. I was a curator at the Mitchell Gallery in Brooklyn, Eleanor continued. I had a beautiful apartment, savings, everything. Then my mother got sick, aggressive cancer. The doctors said she needed experimental treatment. Insurance wouldn't cover it. She took a sip of wine before continuing. I spent everything I had, sold my apartment, took loans. But my mother, she was all I had left after my father died. I couldn't just let her go without trying everything possible. Marcus watched as Eleanor's eyes filled with tears, but she blinked them away quickly. The treatment didn't work. After she died, I was deep in debt. The gallery was going through budget cuts. New management came in. Suddenly, my position was eliminated. Eleanor's voice remained steady, but her hands trembled slightly. I tried to find other jobs, but the art world can be unforgiving. One gap in your resume, one step down, and doors start closing. That's terrible, Marcus said softly. I'm so sorry. The funny thing is, Eleanor continued, I kept thinking it was temporary. I stayed in cheap hotels until the money ran out, then cheaper hotels, then shelters. She smiled sadly. You never think you'll end up homeless. It happens so gradually, then suddenly all at once. Marcus pushed his plate away, no longer hungry. But you kept making art. Art saved me, Eleanor nodded. When I had nothing else, I could still create. Those cards I sold, they weren't just for money. They helped me remember who I was. Marcus stood up and walked to his office, returning with one of Eleanor's cards, the first one he had bought from her months ago. It showed a young girl helping an old man cross the street. I kept this on my desk, he admitted. It reminded me that kindness still exists in this city. Eleanor touched the card gently. Tomorrow, at the wedding, people will make assumptions about me, about us. I wanted you to know the truth. Why are you telling me this now? Marcus asked. Eleanor met his eyes steadily. Because I need to know, are you really taking me to this wedding to get revenge on your ex? To shock people? Or is there another reason? Marcus felt the weight of her question. A week ago, he might have said yes to revenge. But now, looking at Eleanor, dignified, talented, stronger than anyone he knew, he wasn't so sure anymore. I don't know, he answered honestly. At first, maybe it was about revenge. But now, he gestured to the card in his hand. Maybe I just want to show them what they never saw in me, the ability to see beauty in unexpected places. Eleanor was quiet for a long moment. Then she reached into her purse and pulled out a new card. I made this today, she said, sliding it across the table. It was a drawing of two people, seen from behind, looking out a high window at the city below. Even in the simple sketch, you could feel their connection, not romantic, but something deeper. Understanding. Recognition of another soul who knew what it meant to lose everything and still keep going. Tomorrow will be interesting, Eleanor said softly. For both of us. The wedding venue was a beautiful vineyard just outside the city. As Marcus's black Tesla pulled up the long driveway lined with flowering cherry trees, Eleanor's hands tightened slightly in her lap. She looked stunning in her burgundy dress, her hair elegantly styled with subtle makeup that highlighted her natural beauty. Ready? Marcus asked, handing his keys to the valet. He was wearing a perfectly tailored black suit that probably cost more than most people's monthly salary. As ready as I'll ever be, Eleanor replied, accepting his offered arm. She held herself with natural grace, her head high, showing none of the nervousness she felt inside. The moment they walked into the garden where guests were gathering, heads turned. Marcus could hear the whispers starting immediately. His mother, Linda Bennett, dressed in an expensive pale blue outfit, was the first to approach them, her eyes wide with surprise. Marcus, darling, she said, air-kissing his cheek while staring at Eleanor. Aren't you going to introduce me to your friend? Mother, this is Eleanor Washington, Marcus said firmly. Eleanor, my mother, Linda Bennett. Eleanor extended her hand with perfect poise. It's a pleasure to meet you, Mrs. Bennett. Your son has been very kind to me. Linda shook her hand briefly, clearly confused by Eleanor's refined manner of speaking and elegant appearance. Before she could say anything else, more guests approached, including Marcus's Aunt Catherine, a well-known gallery owner in Manhattan. Marcus, Aunt Catherine called out, embracing him. Unlike his mother, she smiled warmly at Eleanor. And who is this lovely woman? Eleanor Washington, Eleanor introduced herself. Marcus has told me you own the Catherine Mills Gallery. Your recent exhibition of emerging African artists was extraordinary. Aunt Catherine's eyes lit up with genuine interest. You're familiar with the exhibition? The use of traditional techniques with modern themes was particularly striking, Eleanor replied, especially in James Nwangi's work. As Eleanor and Aunt Catherine fell into an animated discussion about art, Marcus noticed his ex-fiancée Sarah across the garden. She was wearing a fitted white dress, looking beautiful but slightly anxious as she whispered with her bridesmaids while staring in their direction. "I can't believe he brought her," Marcus overheard one bridesmaid say. "Is he trying to make some kind of statement?" Another guest, an older man Marcus recognized as his father's business partner, approached them. "Bennett," he said gruffly, "interesting choice of date." His tone made it clear exactly what he thought of that choice. Before Marcus could respond, Eleanor turned from her conversation with Aunt Catherine. "Actually, sir," she said with a calm smile, "I'd say Marcus made an excellent choice. Not everyone would be brave enough to look past appearances and see a person's true value." The man blinked, surprised by her articulate response and confident demeanor. Others nearby who had been obviously eavesdropping looked equally shocked. As they made their way to their seats for the ceremony, Marcus noticed something interesting. While some people were still whispering and staring, others seemed drawn to Eleanor. Her genuine warmth and intelligence were breaking through their initial prejudices. "That woman," an elderly lady said loudly to her companion, "carries herself like a queen. Did you hear her discussing Renaissance art with Professor Williams? Quite remarkable." Sarah's mother, Mrs. Cooper, stopped them before they could sit down. "Marcus," she said stiffly, "we didn't expect you to. That is, your guest is absolutely charming," Aunt Catherine interrupted, appearing beside them. "Eleanor, dear, I must hear more about your thoughts on modern art curation. Would you join me after the ceremony?" Eleanor smiled gracefully. "I would be delighted." As they finally took their seats, Marcus leaned close to Eleanor. "You're amazing," he whispered. "You've handled everything perfectly." Eleanor squeezed his hand gently. "When you've lost everything," she whispered back, "you learn what really matters. Their judgments don't define me." The wedding music began to play, and guests stood as Sarah began her walk down the aisle. Marcus watched his ex-fiancée approach, surprised to find that the pain he'd expected to feel wasn't there. Instead, he felt something else. A growing realization that sometimes life's cruelest moments could lead to unexpected blessings. He glanced at Eleanor, who was watching the ceremony with a serene expression. She had shown more dignity in the face of prejudice than any of these wealthy people had shown in their privilege. And somehow, without meaning to, she was teaching all of them, including Marcus, a powerful lesson about true class and character. During the wedding reception, Eleanor found herself seated at a table with Marcus's family, including his art-loving Aunt Catherine. The elegant ballroom sparkled with crystal chandeliers and floating candles, while waiters in black suits served expensive champagne. "So, Eleanor," Aunt Catherine said, leaning forward with genuine interest, "tell me more about your background in art. Your knowledge is impressive." Eleanor glanced at Marcus, who nodded encouragingly. She took a small sip of water and began to speak. "I was actually a curator at the Mitchell Gallery in Brooklyn for several years." "The Mitchell?" Catherine's eyes widened. "I remember their wonderful exhibitions from a few years ago. There was one about urban life that was particularly moving." "City Souls," Eleanor said softly. "That was my last exhibition." Suddenly, Sarah's mother interrupted their conversation, her voice carrying across the table. "Marcus, could I have a word?" Her tone was sharp, and her face showed clear disapproval as she looked at Eleanor. Marcus started to stand, but Eleanor touched his arm gently. "It's okay," she whispered. "Stay, I'm enjoying my conversation with your aunt." As Marcus followed Mrs. Cooper away from the table, Eleanor continued her discussion with Catherine. She pulled out her phone, a simple model Marcus had bought her last week, and showed Catherine some photos she'd taken of her card artwork. "These are extraordinary," Catherine said, studying the images carefully. "The way you capture human connections, it's quite special." At the other end of the ballroom, Marcus found himself cornered by not only Mrs. Cooper, but also his ex-fiancée Sarah, who had left her new husband's side to join them. "What are you trying to prove, Marcus?" Sarah demanded, her white dress rustling as she moved closer. "Bringing someone like her to my wedding." Marcus felt his anger rising. "Someone like her? You mean someone intelligent, talented, and dignified. "Oh, please," Mrs. Cooper cut in. "We all know what this is. You're trying to embarrass us, to make some sort of statement." The only statement being made, Marcus replied coldly, is by you two right now. And it's not a very nice one. Back at the table, Eleanor was now surrounded by several interested guests, including some local art collectors who were fascinated by her knowledge and perspective. She was explaining her views on making art accessible to communities that couldn't afford expensive galleries. Art shouldn't be locked away in expensive buildings, she was saying. It should be where people can see it, where it can touch their lives. The small crowd around her nodded in agreement. Even Marcus's mother, who had been skeptical earlier, seemed impressed. Suddenly, Jonathan, Sarah's new husband and Marcus's former best friend, approached their table. He had clearly had too much champagne, and his face was flushed. "So," he said loudly, drawing unwanted attention, "how much did Marcus pay you to come today? It must have been a lot to make you look this presentable." The room fell silent. Eleanor slowly stood up, her burgundy dress catching the light. Every eye was on her as she faced Jonathan. "Actually," she said in a clear, calm voice that carried across the quiet room, "Marcus didn't pay me anything. He offered me something much more valuable, respect. Something you might want to learn about." Jonathan's face turned red. "You don't know anything about." "I know what it's like to lose everything," Eleanor continued, her voice still steady. "To have people look right through you. But I also know that true character isn't about how much money you have or what you wear. It's about how you treat others, especially those who can't do anything for you in return." The silence in the room was deafening. Some guests looked uncomfortable, others ashamed. Catherine's eyes were shining with tears and admiration. Marcus, who had hurried back when he heard the commotion, stood proudly beside Eleanor. In that moment, any thoughts of revenge or showing off were gone from his mind. Instead, he felt humbled by her grace and strength. "I think," Aunt Catherine said, standing up as well, "we could all learn something from Eleanor." She turned to Eleanor with a serious expression. "My dear, would you be interested in discussing a potential position at my gallery? We could use someone with your perspective and talent." Eleanor's eyes widened in surprise, while around the room, people began to murmur, not with judgment this time, but with respect. The woman they had initially dismissed was proving to be the most impressive person at the wedding. The wedding reception continued, but something had changed in the atmosphere of the grand ballroom. After Eleanor's powerful words to Jonathan, people viewed her differently. Some guests approached her to apologize for their earlier behavior, while others wanted to hear more about her story and her art. Sarah, wearing her beautiful white wedding dress, watched all this from across the room. She kept smoothing her dress nervously, her new husband Jonathan still red-faced and quiet after Eleanor's dignified response to his cruel comment. Finally, Sarah couldn't take it anymore. She walked quickly toward Marcus and Eleanor, who were talking with Aunt Catherine about the gallery position. "Marcus," Sarah said sharply, "can we talk? Privately." Her voice trembled slightly with anger. Marcus started to refuse, but Eleanor touched his arm gently. "Go," she said softly. "Some things need to be said." Sarah led Marcus to a quiet corner of the ballroom's terrace. The evening air was cool, and distant music from the band played softly behind them. For a moment, they stood in awkward silence, looking out at the vineyard's dark grape fields. "You're trying to ruin my wedding," Sarah finally said, her voice breaking. "Bringing her here, making everyone uncomfortable. This was supposed to be my perfect day." Marcus looked at his ex-fiancée carefully. 3 years ago, he had thought she was the most beautiful woman in the world. Now he saw something different, someone so focused on appearances that she had lost sight of what really mattered. "Sarah," he said quietly, "not everything is about you." "What's that supposed to mean?" she demanded. "When I first invited Eleanor to this wedding," Marcus admitted, "maybe I was thinking about revenge, about hurting you the way you hurt me." He paused, looking back into the ballroom where Eleanor was showing some of her card artwork to an interested group of guests. "But she taught me something important." "Oh, really?" Sarah's voice was bitter. "What did your homeless friend teach you?" Just then, Eleanor herself stepped onto the terrace. She had overheard their conversation, but showed no anger at Sarah's words. "I could tell you about losing everything," Eleanor said gently, making both Sarah and Marcus turn in surprise. "About sleeping in shelters, about being invisible to people who once respected me, about watching my mother die despite spending every penny I had trying to save her. Sarah's angry expression faltered, but instead, Eleanor continued, I'll tell you what I learned. Life isn't about the perfect day, the perfect dress, or the perfect image. It's about how we treat each other. It's about seeing the humanity in everyone, even when they're at their lowest point. Sarah's eyes filled with tears. I didn't. I never thought. 3 years ago, Eleanor said, looking at both of them, you two hurt each other deeply. Marcus came to my corner every morning, buying my cards, being kind when others looked away. But he was still carrying that pain, just like you are, Sarah. Marcus felt something tight in his chest begin to loosen as Eleanor spoke. Sometimes, Eleanor continued, we hold on to anger because we think it protects us, but it just keeps us from growing, from seeing new possibilities. She smiled gently at Sarah. This is your wedding day. Instead of worrying about what others think, maybe just be grateful for the love you found. Sarah wiped her eyes carefully, trying not to smear her makeup. I'm sorry, she whispered, looking first at Eleanor, then at Marcus. I'm so sorry. For everything. Marcus felt years of anger and hurt beginning to fade. I'm sorry too, he said quietly. And I hope you and Jonathan are happy together. Eleanor stepped back, watching as her words sank in. Around them, the evening had grown darker, but the terrace was lit by soft golden lights. Inside, the band started playing a slow song, and through the windows, they could see Jonathan looking anxiously for his bride. Your husband is waiting, Eleanor said kindly to Sarah. Go dance. Be happy. Sarah nodded, wiping away the last of her tears. As she turned to go back inside, she paused. Eleanor? She said softly. Thank you. Marcus and Eleanor watched as Sarah walked back into the ballroom, straight into Jonathan's waiting arms. The couple began to dance, and slowly, the tension of the earlier confrontation melted away. You're amazing, Marcus said to Eleanor. You just fixed something I thought was permanently broken. Eleanor smiled, her face glowing in the soft terrace lights. Sometimes the best art isn't on canvas, she said. It's in helping people see things differently. 2 months after the wedding, Eleanor stood in front of the Catherine Mills Gallery, holding her new employee badge. She was wearing a professional blue dress, not the expensive ones from the wedding preparation, but one she had bought herself with her first paycheck as the gallery's new community outreach coordinator. The morning sun reflected off the gallery's windows as she unlocked the front door. Inside, workers were setting up her first exhibition, Street Hearts, Art from the Invisible. The show featured artwork by homeless artists from around the city, including some of Eleanor's own card drawings from her time on the streets. Marcus arrived just as she was adjusting the lighting for one of the displays. He still wore his expensive suits, but something about him had changed since the wedding. He seemed more relaxed, more genuine. Ready for your big opening tonight? He asked, handing her a coffee, the same kind he used to bring her outside the daily grind. Nervous, Eleanor admitted, accepting the coffee, but excited. Did you see the final catalog? Marcus picked up one of the glossy exhibition catalogs from the front desk. On the cover was Eleanor's drawing from the night before the wedding, one of two people looking out at the city from above. The gallery had chosen it as the symbol of the show. Aunt Catherine says ticket sales for the opening are breaking records, Marcus said proudly. Everyone wants to see the exhibition that's making headlines. Former homeless artist brings street art to high society. Eleanor shook her head, smiling. I still can't believe how much has changed. 2 months ago, I was selling cards on the street. Now, she gestured at the gallery around her. Now you're changing lives, Marcus finished. The art program you started at the homeless shelter is already making a difference. It was true. After starting her job at the gallery, Eleanor had immediately proposed a program to teach art to homeless people, giving them a creative outlet and a way to earn money through their work. The gallery sold their art and returned all profits to the artists. Speaking of change, Eleanor said, straightening a frame on the wall, I moved into my new apartment yesterday. Marcus grinned. Finally left the hotel. It was time, Eleanor nodded. The hotel was wonderful, but I needed to stand on my own feet again. It's a small studio, but it's mine. I paid the deposit with my own money. They walked through the gallery, looking at the artwork. Each piece told a story of survival, hope, and dignity. Eleanor stopped at one particular drawing. It showed the corner where she used to sit, but from a new perspective. You know, she said thoughtfully, when you first invited me to that wedding, I thought you were just using me to get revenge. I was, Marcus admitted. Or at least I thought I was, but you changed everything. We changed each other, Eleanor corrected him. You saw me when I was invisible. I helped you see past your pain. Just then, Aunt Catherine walked in, carrying a stack of newspapers. Eleanor, darling, have you seen the art section today? The New York Times had done a full-page feature on Eleanor's exhibition. The article praised her innovative approach to art curation and her efforts to bridge the gap between high-end galleries and street artists. They're calling you a visionary, Catherine said proudly. And they're right, you brought something special to this gallery. Eleanor felt tears in her eyes as she read the article. I never thought I'd be here again, she said softly, not after losing everything. Sometimes, Marcus said, losing everything helps you find what really matters. That evening, as Eleanor prepared to welcome guests to her exhibition opening, she took one last walk through the gallery. The walls were filled with artwork that told stories of struggle, resilience, and hope. Her own journey from the street corner to this moment was just one of many stories being told. Marcus watched from the entrance as Eleanor spoke with reporters, collectors, and artists. She moved with the same dignity she had shown at the wedding, but now it was amplified by purpose and achievement. You know what's funny? He said when she finally joined him. I invited you to that wedding thinking I was helping you. Turns out, you helped me more. Eleanor smiled, looking around at the gallery that was now her world again. Maybe that's the real art, she said. Not just seeing beauty in unexpected places, but helping others see it too. As the first guests began to arrive, Eleanor squared her shoulders and prepared to welcome them. She had come full circle, from success to loss to success again, but this time she carried with her a deeper understanding of both art and humanity. And somewhere in the gallery hung the simple card, showing two people looking out at a city of endless possibilities.